Order, the committee will now resume consideration of H.R. 50, the Unfunded Mandates Information Transparency Act of 2017. Questions on favorably reporting H.R. 50 as amended. A recorded vote having previously been ordered, the clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Gowdy?
Yes.
Mr. Gowdy votes yes. Mr. Duncan? Mr. Issa? Mr. Jordan? Mr. Jordan votes yes. Mr. Sanford? Mr. Sanford votes yes. Mr. Amash? Mr. Amash votes yes. Mr. Gosar? Mr. Desjardins? Mr. Farenthold? Mr. Farenthold votes yes. Ms. Fox? Ms. Fox votes yes. Mr. Massey? Mr. Massey votes yes. Mr. Meadows? Mr. Meadows votes yes. Mr. DeSantis? Mr. Ross? Mr. Ross votes yes. Mr. Walker? Mr. Walker votes yes. Mr. Blum? Mr. Blum votes aye. Mr. Heiss? Mr. Heiss votes yes. Mr. Russell? Mr. Russell votes yes. Mr. Grothman? Mr. Hurd? Mr. Hurd votes yes. Mr. Palmer? Mr. Palmer votes yes. Mr. Comer? Mr. Comer votes yes. Mr. Mitchell? Mr. Mitchell votes yes. Mr. Gianforte? Mr. Gianforte votes yes. Mr. Cummings? Ms. Maloney? No. Ms. Maloney votes no. Ms. Norton?
No.
Ms. Norton votes no. Mr. Clay? Mr. Lynch? No. Mr. Lynch votes no. Mr. Cooper? Mr. Connolly?
Nay.
Mr. Connolly votes nay. Ms. Kelly? Ms. Kelly votes no. Ms. Lawrence? Ms. Watson-Coleman? Ms. Watson-Coleman votes no. Mr. Krishnamurthy? Mr. Raskin? Mr. Gomez? Mr. Welch? Mr. Cartwright?
No.
Mr. Cartwright votes no. Mr. Desaulniers? Mr. Desaulniers votes no. Ms. Plaskett? Mr. Sarbanes? Mr. Sarbanes votes no. You are not recorded. Mr. Clay votes no.
The gentleman from Tennessee, Dr. Desjardins.
Mr. Desjardins votes yes.
The gentleman from Montana? I think he's already voted. Is Mr. Gianforte recorded?
Yes. Yes, he is.
The gentleman from Wisconsin?
Yes. Mr. Grothman votes yes.
Mr. Lynch, have you been recorded? Has Mr. Lynch been recorded?
Mr. Lynch voted no.
Thank you.
Have all members voted? The clerk will report the tally.
Mr. Chairman, on this vote, there are 20 ayes and 10 noes.
The ayes have it. The bill is ordered favorably reported as amended. Without objection, the motion to reconsider is laid upon the table. I ask unanimous consent that staff be allowed to make necessary technical and conforming changes to the bills ordered reported today, subject to the approval of the minority. Without objection, so ordered. If there's no further business, and before we adjourn, I just want to thank everybody for being here. I know that there are a lot of demands on your time, and I appreciate the quality and nature of the discussion and the debate, and it's been a privilege to be with you for the better part of half a day. With that, the committee stands adjourned.